Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It is now 12 o'clock. We get to do our lunch and learn today. My name is Calvin Decker. I'm with CodaBears. We're going to talk about the new features in 24.1 and forward of blanket POs versus what used to be in the system since 9, Kanban POs. So we're going to take a look at the pros and cons of both of them and kind of the best practices. So setting up the blanket PO, setting up a Kanban PO. Then we'll also talk about purchase order setup. And then what are some best practices and how do we send updates out automatically? So without any ado, we'll go ahead and move on to our next slide here. So here in purchase management, under the part, we need to update the warehouse and the bin tab. The Kanban information is stored over here. We'll talk about that in a second. Next, we'll go into the purchase order setup, like I talked about, and then we'll do how do we send out updates automatically? Do we have the system email a change PO? Does it just send out an email notifying them, hey, we're adding this release to our PO? And then what are some of the best practices with managing these going forward? Because Blanket and Kanban POs, we generally set those up for a year or more and just let them automatically fill as we need parts. So in the part setup, on the Sites tab, there is a warehouse detail. The replenishment type needs to be set up. There's going to be a Kanban purchase. Is this a replenishment for AMM to move materials from one location to the other? The action that it's going to follow, and then what are the inventory quantities that we should be moving? Now, I can do a replenishment purchase order, which would be a Kanban purchase order. This has been in existence for 8+ years. We also have a new area called the blanket PO. The blanket PO says, I've created a blanket for 100,000 of this item. It's for 2025. I will turn around and send the releases to the vendor as I have demand records come into the system. With the Kanban replenishment, it works very similarly. We can turn around and set up a PO, but we don't set the PO up for 100,000 pieces. The PO is set up for the first demand quantity required. Then as additional demand quantities become prevalent, the system will add another release for that quantity and send that off to the vendor. So kind of a Kanban PO is, think of the releases being added constantly. The blanket is very similar, but we're going to talk about modifying the blanket so that the first release is the total line. The second release is our first shipment. The third release is the next shipment, and we constantly decrement the first release so that we don't have to reapprove those POs. So we need to have a warehouse replenishment if we're going to do one of the two. Next is on the part bin, we can also have this set up with a Kanban on a bin. So this way I can say I want to have the supermarket have minimum inventory. The system's going to monitor the inventory levels and create PO suggestions when we drop below. I can tie a Kanban PO to a specific bin, and now I always want to keep 50 parts on the line in this bin. And I can make it be a Kanban, or I can also have an auto replenish if we're using the AMM module, telling someone to move parts from the supermarket or whatever our supply warehouse is to our destination. Once we get the part updated, there's not a whole lot behind this. We're going to set up our bin. We're going to go ahead and pick our replenishment. So I turn around through Kanban purchase, and we need to put a PO number in here that's going to be the purchase order that we automatically add items onto. As the system processes, somebody makes an inventory transaction, the inventory drops below the levels that we request, the system will turn around and purchase additional based on the settings that we put in here. So when I set up a purchase order, I'm going to create a normal purchase order just like I would in the system. If I'm doing a blanket, on the very first release, I would put in the total that I want to order for the whole year or for the term of the contract that we're doing. When additional releases get added, I'm going to be setting the due date and the quantity just on those when it comes in. Now the system will go ahead and add those, but I'm going to recommend that we don't automatically send those out. And what we built for a solution is when a release gets added, we decrement the quantity from the first release. So if we ordered 100,000 and my first order needs 10,000 parts, I'm going to decrement my first release to 990,000 because line release 2 is going to be for the total, bringing it back to the total quantity of 100,000. By keeping this and maintaining it, we don't have to worry about going through PO approvals again because the PO value hasn't changed. As we add that decrement, those PO approvals stay right along the side with a blanket PO. With a Kanban, we would put the starting quantity on release 1 for the demand record that's saying, hey, I need parts for this Kanban. As additional demand records get created, a job gets released or someone sells an item for purchase, the system's going to add additional releases to this PO. If you're using approvals, it may force to go through that approval process again. You can set up a buyer with an unlimited approval, and then any Kanban POs go under that buyer so that they don't have to go through the approval. That is also a way to make sure that someone reviewed the Kanban PO before we just sent it to the vendor in an automated fashion. So the Kanban is going to follow the PO approval rules. With the blanket, we really don't have to worry about that because the PO value hasn't changed for the total contract. Now, if you reach the end of the year or 10 months into the year and you haven't reached the end of the PO, if you go in and increase that from 100,000 to 120,000, you would have to go through the approval process again if that was above your spending threshold. We have blanket POs and we have Kanban POs now. One, the system is going to auto purchase for either of them, but are we adding a release to the shipping schedule or are we adding and decrementing, keeping the same value? Once those POs get created, we go back to the part record and we update the warehouse or the bin and we set that PO number and line number so that the system knows which purchase order to automatically add these transactions to. The system's going to go ahead and just update those. We talked about the difference between Kanban and blanket. Kanban, think more of as a replenishment, keeping levels at a consistent area. Blankets, I'm going to set out a blanket PO for the whole year and then add releases as I need the items to come in. With Epicor's directives, whether method or data, however you want to do this, when that purchase order is updated and goes back out, do we send that automatically to the vendor or do we have that get emailed to the buyer? They look it over and then forward that email to the vendor on that purchase. That's probably a safer way to do that. Have it go to the buyer first, because if somebody went in and fat fingered a transaction in inventory, and instead of issuing 100, they issued 100,000. Well, that's going to throw your PO upside down. System would automatically go buy those extra parts for that error and then send it out. Now, when they fix the inventory, we're probably going to see a suggestion to, hey, decrease the quantity, but the damage could have already been done if we send that out in an automated fashion. PO approvals are both followed with the blanket and the Kanban orders. It's just the blanket. We set that PO approval at the top for the total contract. With the Kanban, we just have to keep adding on. Customizations that I will recommend that you put onto your purchase orders is, what is my estimated annual usage or my estimated monthly usage? So that if we do have the system adding a quantity greater than what the value should be for the time period, maybe we put that purchase order in a pending and we don't approve it and continue it out. We should also have an expiration date for when does that PO die. Now, with a blanket order on that PO release, you can put the end date of the contract on that release line 1, because as you add the additional releases, it's going to turn around and put dates and quantities on there. Dashboards that we would probably recommend having in the system for this is expiring blanket or Kanban POs. If these are coming up to the end of life, we need to go in and create a new blanket or figure out what we're doing, but we may not just want our blanket PO to just run indefinitely. Same thing, not just expiring, but when are we reaching end of life? If I put that blanket in for 100,000 and I just ordered 990,000, that should show up on the dashboard to let the buyer know either go increase the quantity or create a new PO and then go back to the part and update the new purchase contract for it. When you create the new purchase contract, I would just close out the old PO because we may not be getting the last 10,000, but that will be coming in on the new purchase order. So by closing that out, it would be a little safer. Either of these systems are now available and are going to streamline the purchasing process inside Epicor. So by setting up blanket purchase orders, I only have to set up one PO and then turn around and monitor the releases that get added. If I do a Kanban, the system will automatically add additional releases and send it out. Either way, if we can get 80% of our parts to go on a blanket or a Kanban, that only leaves the buyer having to manage the last 20%. That's a great reduction in how many POs each buyer has to maintain. We kind of went over blankets, we went over Kanbans, and both are out there now for us to use. This does require 24.1 or a newer version in order to use the blank. In order to use the Kanban, it was after version 9. This was kind of our punch list of areas that we covered in today's Lunch and Learn. Hopefully this was super simple. It's not very complex to use, but a lot of people that I find out in the community don't know these things exist, and they're creating purchase orders one by one. Or they'll have the system generate suggestions and then they go approve them. Thanks, everyone.